Good afternoon. Welcome to American Islamic College Lecture Series program. Today we have with us a very distinguished guest, Ms. Shadab Hashmi. She will be speaking today on Escaping the Margins, Poetry of Protest, and Poetry of Power. She wrote a book called Baker of Tarifa, which is on the history of interfaith tolerance in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, and it won the 2011 San Diego Book Award for Poetry. Her new collection, Chak, delves into questions of identity as she explores Pakistan's colonial history, the ravages of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which she observed as a child growing up in Peshawar, and the post-9/11 wars during which she has been raising her own children. Hashmi has presented her poetry and poetry based on the Urdu forms of ghazal and qasida in Turkey, Pakistan, and the UK. Please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Shadab Hashmi.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Romana. It's wonderful to be here. So great honor and delight. So I'll give the promised talk first, and then I'll read some poems. So the topic, as you know, is escaping the margins. Poetry of protest, poetry of power. I began writing poetry on a campus of red brick corridors, ancient oaks, belligerent crows, and sharp-witted, lively women who thrived on critical thinking. Kinnaid College in Lahore, Pakistan. In my earliest writing, I seem to have tested truths, grappled with the abstract, as many young people do, building a dialectic between the sensory, cerebral, and emotional in an attempt to catch the elusive. And then, from my immediate surroundings, came news of an incident that shocked me out of my juvenile navel-gazing. It was the news of a campus staffer's son committing suicide. Rumor had it that he had been unwilling to join the father's vocation of managing the college cafe, or tuck shop as we called it. To compound the matter, he had found the family's Christian faith hard to reconcile in a society that unfortunately did not look upon minorities as equals. The young man's father, Chaudhry Sahab, who carried himself as a campus elder and enjoyed well-deserved popularity among the students, may have missed the early signs of his son's anxieties and aspirations, neglecting to acknowledge that he belonged to the new generation and rightly envisioned a life different from the one into which he was born. The details of the story were never clear to me, but my emotions were. I wrote my first protest poem. This incident opened my eyes to social injustice and exploitation, as well as the dehumanizing effects of the war in bordering Afghanistan. I wrote about child labor, famine, and refugees, about young women becoming war widows, and children losing their limbs in landmines. And then I came to America to study. I continued writing poetry in response to the news, but in this environment, I was the minority. As a young Muslim woman, I was not just any minority, but the one which perhaps bears the burden of a foreclosed discussion more than any other minority group in America. One which is expected to be unable to speak for itself, imagined to have emerged from under a mountain of oppression. I found myself in the midst of people who not only knew nothing about Muslim women, but very little about Islam itself. This was a culture of little knowledge about anything outside of the Occidentocentric domain, but a great deal of certitude about it. A culture of discussion and debate, yet a culture that insisted upon promoting via a mammoth media a preconceived, inaccurate narrative of who I was and where I came from as a Muslim. here is when I ask the most important questions. Where do I really come from as a Muslim? What is my place as a Muslim in the West? A poet seeking identity is not an extraordinary thing, but a poet whose identity is forced upon her in the form of a predominant narrative which is perpetuated in academia and popular culture is an extraordinary thing. It provoked a political response. But poets who want to write something of value choose instinct over agenda, discovery over dogma. As I wrote my creative thesis, I was fortunate to work with a professor who encouraged me to deepen my work and make discoveries as I wrote. I discovered that protest, though urgent and important, inhabits the margins. So, in exploring my identity as a Muslim woman living in the West, I shifted away from being a protest poet and delved into the history of Muslim civilization. My instinct was to create a poetic lexicon that is divested of post-colonial, neo-colonial filters, and to see myself from the eye of human history, to coin my own idiom to define myself. In other words, to redirect the current of protest poetry to a poetry of power. Needless to say, if you know this my work, you know this, by power I don't mean dominance and supremacy, but gaining a rightful autonomy in constructing a language that contains the self on its own terms, rather than being an acerbic answer or a weak echo of another. A way to clear the blind spots of the mainstream Western narrative I had come across. A narrative, as I later discovered in my research, designed on deliberate omissions. It is a narrative of intellectual inferiority, backwardness, and zealotry, perpetuated not only through Western discourse, but also through the post-colonial impoverishment of thought and detachment from history, especially the history of Muslims in the West that is rampant among us Muslims. Therefore, my earlier question, do I really know who I am? Baker of Tarifa is a series of poems based on the history of Muslim Spain. Many of you know the history of Al-Andalus, so this is the book that deals with nearly 800 years of this civilization called Al-Andalus. It attempts to recreate a near millennium of Andalusi culture which transformed Western thought, values, art, science, and technology, building a legend of peaceful coexistence known as La Convivencia. The work looks at Muslim civilization as a bridge between antiquity and modernity, East and West, between three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, and three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A golden chapter not only in Muslim and European history, but human history. Coal and Chalk, written simultaneously with my first book, includes poems that protest the conditions that have caused turmoil and trauma, and the consequent deterioration of the Muslim identity. These protest poems come from my childhood experience of the Soviet war in bordering Afghanistan, as well as the present global violence in wars against terror and terrorism. Both books explore conflict and dream of peace. The journey that has come to be about protesting against oppression and building a coherent literary language to define myself as a Muslim in the West originally came from a response to tragedy that befell a Christian in Pakistan years ago. I was as much a Muslim poet then as now, and the impulse as much a desire for justice and peace then as now. So with that introduction, I'm going to read some poems. My most recent work is bringing together these two impulses. One is to protest what is going on around us. That's something that almost all poets do, whether they call themselves political poets or not. And the other impulse is to create the language I was talking about, creating a language that sort of is a continuation of our cultural and religious heritage. I'm going to read some recent poems before I go into Baker of Tarif and Coal and Chalk. This one has to do with something that people don't talk about often enough. This poem is called The Smallest Drone, and it came from my research on the olfactory sense. So I was teaching a workshop on the sense of smell, and I was trying to build a sort of relationship between our sense of smell and our ability to remember vividly and to be able to write poetry in response to recalling things from the past. So as I was doing research, I came across a blog. And this blog praises drones. As you know, drones smell things, meaning that they have these sensors that are used in finding out if there are dead bodies or chemical weapons and so on. So I'm going to read the sentence that started off this poem. The Arcturus T-20 drone can carry 2 small 10-pound laser-guided missiles that can turn any target into pasta sauce with the click of a mouse. So not only does it give you information about what this drone does, it tells you that it's a very small drone, it's the smallest around, and the tone tells you that this person's rather happy that human beings are being turned into pasta sauce. So I thought about the smallest drone. What does it mean for someone to be handling a small weapon of mass destruction? And I thought about babies, because the weight and the size is very close to an infant size. And I imagined these people who handle these missiles as fathers and mothers. And the question whether they think about other fathers and mothers who will lose their family with these drones. The smallest drone, with a belly full of metal and no neck, that turns to lock you in a melting gaze, lake of Babylonian honey, with its thick, hypnotic rippling in the crook of your arm. It reminds you of your infant only for its weight, its familiar size, as you cradle it. This missile, its 10 pounds of chilling blindness, rises nightly to swim in your copper dreams, where your child plays with mangled beekeepers and those surviving too long, who sleep fitfully, always between 2 screams. Another new poem that was written in response to what happened in Gaza 2 years ago. This is a new form I'm exploring. It's breathless, which means there are no punctuation marks. So you have to sort of parse it yourself. Dystopia looks like a schoolgirl with a perfect braid and rubble for a face. She speaks in the cut-up voice of the generation she will mother with ashen arms. She speaks only when her roller coaster car creaks to the top and civilization hangs. All rust, meat and more lust, Thanks for the tea, it lasted longer than metal dug and fashioned into bombs with flechettes, which sound like French pastry, but feel like flesh hooked to a megaton pull, the collapse, the contract to rebuild a country and another and another. So yes, the fruit and the blade are never too far from each other on your tongue, but must you, muscle you, to fill your void with dead honeybees, then seek the meaning of sweetness and call it news? As you know, we are losing honeybees from our planet. So that was a reference to that. You need to take a deep breath after this poem because there are no breaths in this poem. So before I go on to Baker of Tarifa, I'm going to read a ghazal. As some of you may know, a ghazal is Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Turkish form, and it's been written in the form has been used in many different languages. For the past half a century, we've been writing the ghazal in English. And I'm going to give you a very brief description of what a ghazal is. It's a poem that's written in couplets, 2 lines. So a unit is 2 lines. Each unit is emotionally, thematically, ideationally independent. And what joins the whole poem is not the idea. So there isn't a single idea in the poem. There are many ideas and emotions in the poem, tones in the poem. It's the refrain. So like a song, the poem has a refrain. And the refrain is what sonically brings together the whole poem. The refrain in the one that I'm going to read is window. And because the reading is so intense and the times are so intense, we're going to read this together in the traditional style. As again, some of you know that in the traditional style, the ghazal poet recites the poem and the audience chimes in when the refrain is delivered. And because you already know the refrain. The refrain in this poem is window. Every other line will end with the word window. So if you are so inclined, you may join me when I say the word window. Tea kettles are filled with pebbles. Lizards lie in the shade of the window. Tea kettles are filled with pebbles. Lizards lie in the shade of the window. When the roof has thorns, doors bricked up, hope is made of the window. Socrates sleeps like a baby in a boat of logic, while the cell and the centuries fade. Socrates sleeps like a baby in a boat of logic, while the cell and the centuries fade. The youth shudder at the punishment, cup of hemlock or flayed by the window. Hear thought begetting thought in goatskin bagpipes, hear logic in rain. Hear thought begetting thought in goatskin bagpipes, hear logic in rain. Ask and wait, as Socrates did. The mind's endless music is played at the window. The jailed mystic carves a bowl of stone. The poet writes on a cup of styrofoam. The jailed mystic carves a bowl of stone. The poet writes on a cup of styrofoam. By day, prison guards taunt. By night, are haunted by words prayed at the window. You left behind a shuttered palace for a single name carved in wood grain. You left behind a shuttered palace for a single name carved in wood grain. Desire's forest is treacherous these. Let wisdom ripen in a glade by the window. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Baker of Tarifa. As you know, that this is the book that celebrates the Convivencia, or the peaceful coexistence between the Abrahamic people, a legend of tolerance, and it's also a legend of great intellectual accomplishments. This was a time when beautiful buildings were built, and advances were made in science and technology, in mathematics and philosophy, and techniques of navigation, medical instruments, surgical instruments, all kinds of things. There's a lot to learn about these 800 years, nearly 800 years of human history. So this book, the primary metaphor in the book is bread, because there's so much that happened in this time, and this time itself is a near millennium, that I wanted one metaphor that could bring together what is most important to me about this time. Peaceful coexistence, acknowledging of differences, and being able to get along. This is the biggest challenge that human beings seem to face. I'm going to read a couple of poems, and then we're going to read a performance poem together. I'll need 2 people to join me. I already have 1 volunteer, but 2 more people to read a performance poem. I'm going to read 2 poems, and then we'll do that one. So this first one that I'm going to read is called Window Overlooking the Fern. The doe lies dreaming, pregnant and smooth in an earthen basin. It is summer, and the soap-white curtains are exhaling like sails. There's faraway laughter and a pulse nearby in oil semolina. She catches the pulse, the imprint of fate lines. It is the summer of barley, white flour, spiced honey, lavender, sourdough from the houses of Jewish leather merchants, Christian boatmen, singers, Muslim botanists, held by a mother with coal-lined eyes, bread for apricot-skinned children. In this story, there are moments of conflict. There are moments of conflict resolution. There are moments that, to me, are very idyllic because, I imagine Muslims, Christians, and Jews sharing the same libraries, working together, writing books together. And as a Muslim, one of the things that I really admire about this time is that women were educated. They were, most of the scribes, the copyists of manuscripts were women. And there was even a Muslim woman judge, and women who practiced law, who were active teachers of philosophy, famous poets, and so on and so forth. Even a woman a famous mathematician, who was also a librarian. She doubled as a librarian. So the famous people that I'm really proud of as a Muslim woman. So there are lots of stories in this book, but since we don't have that much time, I'm going to read a little bit about a different phase in this history. So in this book, there is a section that deals with the time of the Convivencia, when everything was, like I said, idyllic. And there's a phase where conflicts emerged. And then the last section in this book deals with the collapse of this civilization. As you know, that this period ended with the Inquisition, famous or infamous for its brutality. I'm going to read a poem called Montage, and this is the section that sort of introduces the conflicts. And in this poem, you'll hear the word Andalusian. It refers to the person from Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, and also refers to the horse breed Andalusian, which is a very famous horse breed. So you have to think about both things as you listen to the poem. Montage. The Andalusian is known for sensitivity and intelligence. A Christian chronicler writes of Muslims. The handsomest among them was as black as the cooking pot. Adafina is a cooking pot used by Jews. It is buried in embers on Friday night. The meal is ready for the next day. On Friday, Muslims are advised to take the long way home after prayer so they can greet neighbors. Christians must love their neighbor as themselves. Adafina comes from dafn, or buried, in Arabic. The Andalusian is often drawn with black pigment. Arabic is a Semitic language. Burnt bones were used to make black. The Andalusian is mostly gray and rarely has a pearl, buckskin, or chestnut coat. The highest commandment for Jews, Muslims, and Christians: love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The Andalusian is prized as a war horse. So then it goes on to describe the tragic conflicts and the tragic collapse of this civilization. And now I'm going to invite my wonderful volunteer, poet, Faisal Moinuddin, and also any other volunteers. This is a performance piece. It's not very long, and I need 3 voices for it. So I've already got 1, and I need 2 more. Thank you, Richard. And if I can have 1 more. Please. Yes. Yes. So you know how it works?
I do. I'll listen.
You can explain it.
Okay. Do you want to explain? I feel like
I'll do that. I'll also give a little back while you're looking at the phone. It's going to be read horizontally, like regular text. So line 1, line 2, line 3. Except you're the 3 voices, and you can be voice 1, you can be voice 2, and you can be voice 3. So columns. He's the first column. You are the second column, and you're the third column. Okay. And let's see. Some of the words are delivered together. We'll figure it out. While I'm explaining, you can read the phone.
And then so the second line would be pretty much the
This
same
is
time.
the-
So you'd start.
This is the first
sweet stuff,
line,
then
and
maybe do.
they don't have anything, it's going to be quiet,
And then
it's you, and then him, and
In
then her,
order.
in the order of the
Okay,
columns.
but the first one would be.
It's
Then I would
silence
pick
for
the
you.
next.
It's silence for you, and he goes on, meaning that this is the first line,
Okay.
and so you guys say nothing, and then he goes on to the next line.
Because then I say something.
Right.
Okay.
So I'll describe the poem a little bit. Since this book is about togetherness, it's about collaboration, it's about groups, individuals as well as groups. This poem is called The Confectioner's District in Sevilla. So in Sevilla, by the river, there is an area where all the bakers live, people who make bread and sweets, so the confectioners. And there are a number of poems that have to do with bread and sweets in this book and I've included recipes, real Andalusi recipes that survived the Inquisition. And so the idea is, there are 2 things to remember. One is that Muslims were the one to bring sugar into Europe. Sugarcane was originally grown in Malaysia and the Malay Islands, and then it traveled, the crop traveled and it made it into Europe via Al-Andalus, Spain, and sugar made out of sugarcane was something new to Europe. So that's the bit of trivia that I wanted to tell you. But this district of confectioners I thought was how wonderful. The whole place, that specialized in making goodies, all kinds of pastries and all kinds of sweet things and bread. Now, in the morning, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and many other people of many other religions, when they wake up, the first thing they do is they pray, right? So I imagine these bakers who have to wake up before everybody else to make their bread. I imagine them waking up at that hour where few people are up and making their prayers. And I imagine them as a choir, as a group of people who are, who are expressing their feelings. So you hear the poem. So this poem is meant for 3 voices, and our wonderful volunteers are going to read the poem. It's called The Confectioner's District in Sevilla.
The river, sweets in its spine.
Sweets in its spine.
Gold in mouth.
The river,
Shivering before dawn.
Honeycomb.
Simmering alchemy.
God's honey boiling.
Shivering.
Shivering before dawn.
before dawn, the confectioners awaken.
To different gods.
Same sugar.
The confectioners awaken.
From orange blossom, blossom.
Dreams.
Figs. Pomegranates.
Cream.
Promises.
Of milk and honey.
Honey become word.
The river stirs.
Word become vapor.
Rises.
The ovens heat up.
The dough rises.
The dough rises.
The dough rises.
The dough rises.
The sun rises.
Honey river boils over.
Hell and heaven.
Heaven and hell.
The sun rises.
On the patisseries.
The bakeries.
Sugar dust rises.
In places of worship.
Different places.
Same God. Different places.
Same God.
Sugar dust settles.
All stores.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was wonderfully done. Great performance. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to read some poems from Coal and Chalk. Let's see. This was already said, but I'm going to say it again. This book is autobiographical. Some of the poems are about the time I was growing up in Peshawar, Pakistan, which is the north border with Afghanistan, and my encounter with refugees and war and so on and so forth in an otherwise peaceful city. And then the rest of the book is about me raising my children in the U.S. So living as an immigrant, as a Muslim American woman, and living as a mother and as a writer. Monsoon. Why the pale mosquito net over the charpai I slept on all summer still falls liquid in my memory like sugarcane juice, or why the polonaise is like running along the small green humps of a single hill in Europe where no one dies of summer, I don't know. But when the sky growls and lightning crackles its long plastic fingers, the dusty jamun is less ghost, more tree. The city, baked hollow in the sun's furnace, sprouts double-shaded roses. When the rains come, I bring Socrates from the glass shelves, cut a mango in cubes to go with some milk. There is no need for Chopin, because the young Afghan from the refugee camp, who made himself a wheelchair after the war, plays his flute all day long to the rain's vigorous beat. U.S. airstrikes. I wrote this in 2003 and about Iraq. U.S. airstrikes. In the 4 minutes it took me to mince the cloves, dump the tea leaves in the rose bush, and soap the carafe, a whole city was lost. There were feet still in school shoes, limp flesh singing into satchels, clinging to a post, a shattered clock. The children, if not orphaned, were purpled beyond recognition. Orders had been carried down, one signal igniting another, and a man had let a deafening rhapsody guide his young hand to drop a 500-pound bomb on a mosque. Just when I finished rinsing the carafe, a whole city was under cement dust and smoke. And I thought I heard screaming behind walls of fire in the kettle's sharp whistle when I added the cloves, the last green lime. Guantanamo. A guard forces you to urinate on yourself. Another barks out louder than his dog the names of your sisters who live in the delicate nest of a ruby-throated hummingbird. Each will be a skeleton, he says. Was there someone who gave you 7 almonds for memory? A teaspoon of honey every morning? Cardamom tea before bed? Someone who starched your shirts in rice water and then ironed them, held your chin to say the send-off prayer before school. You're tied to a metal coil, and memory is a burnt wire. I'm going to read a poem that I call my rant. There's another one that I want to read too. 2 poems. The first one I'm going to read is set in Lahore, and it's called The Road. It tells a story of stereotyping, basically. The title of this book is Coal and Chalk, which is many things. It's metaphors. They're metaphors for many things, both coal and chalk. But one of the themes that I had in mind was seeing things in black and white, the loss of nuance. This is what we've been seeing in the past decade and a half, and it's true about. Basically, it's universally true. In this story, in the poem that I'm going to read, there are 2 characters, main characters. First one is a man in a beard, in an Islamic beard. Second one is a very highly educated, wealthy, and powerful woman. When you think about these 2 images, the thought that comes to mind is one is a terrorist and the other is an oppressed Muslim woman. But in this poem, the opposite is true. This poem is about corrupt politicians who exploit ordinary people. And in this story, in a story, a terrorist attack happens on a mosque. And the muezzin, who is an innocent person, who's a good person, he dies. And the emergency help that he requires is blocked by MNA's car. And MNA is a member of National Assembly. And I'm going to also use the word shopper, which is Pakistani slang for a plastic shopping bag. The road. A muezzin rides his motorbike to the mosque that will, by afternoon, melt down to the last ablution faucet or blade of the ceiling fan, the last worshipper. Locked in by traffic, an ambulance no one clears the way for. The gaunt policeman's whistle is for the errant rickshaw driver or students likely from the arts or Pakistan studies departments in their dilapidated models. At such intersections, there usually are boys selling strings of jasmines for the wrist or jute hand fans or the newspaper that serves better as a hand fan. It is over 50 degrees Celsius, which means death for the sharbat vendor, who can no longer afford to buy or keep ice, and the laborer working the day shift. The MNA, that's member of National Assembly, the woman I mentioned before, won't see this through her Ferragamo sunglasses and tinted windows as she is rushed from the Assembly House for her salon appointment. The sirens of her police escort will neatly bury the cacophony of the explosion in the mosque. But she might notice a motorbike and a shopper filled with mangoes hanging on one side and another with new sandals for a boy the same age as her own. So there's only 1 minute left, or less, 40 seconds. And I'm going to finish with a poem. But before that, I want to thank American Islamic College for inviting me to present my poetry, and thank you, Romana, and thank you all for being here. And I'm gonna try to find the poem that I'm gonna finish with. Just a second. Okay. This poem is called It's in Sleep a Soul Will Know Itself, another poem about stereotyping. I am neither a Persian nor a Mughal miniature, no toothless gazelle, ivory hand fan, sitar tremolo, rose syrup, no tiger hunt, velvet howdah, sweltering divan of poems. I looked but did not find myself under the desert's backlit, piercing clocks, its lexicon of loss, lures and winds of woven fragrance. I was never a black and white begum blooming out of a souffle of silk gharara, leaning on a gold cane, nor a sepia Sahab Bahadur with his shoe on the lap of a native. I never rode a motorbike through a tunnel under a river, no cigarette in my mouth, nor a niqab pressed to my nose. When I close my eyes, I am the ripped tire rolling beside a barefoot boy with a stick. I spin to his whim across a rocky, jasmine-scented hill. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We'll have Q&A now. The food is here. Apologies that it was late. In order to keep things moving, if you all want to go in pairs, 2 by 2, grab a plate and come in. We can continue with the Q&A. Does that sound
Okay,
good?
sure.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if I'm audible, I'd like to sit down, or if you can you hear me without the mic? Or let me just try staying here for a few minutes, or if I get tired, I'll sit down. Okay, or I'll keep the mic with me. Okay.
Any questions?
I'm ready.
No.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I would just, when you opened up, sort of like you're looking to having an monopoly, what's suffering in the U.S. As an African American male, I got the issue with that. So not that we have this monopoly of suffering, but a let's try to make room and let's be sensitive.
That's a fair comment, but I would like to read what I've read in my speech. I didn't say that Muslim women are the only people who suffer in America. I said, I'd like to go back and use the right words because I think you misunderstood what I said.
That's why it helps to write things down. Would you like to make your comment again so that?
I'll let her read. So
Okay. Okay.
Can you repeat your question, please?
So he says that you sound like you have a monopoly over suffering in the United States, by the comment, judging from the comment that I made. And I'd like to read my comment one more time because the last thing I want to be is insensitive. And that was basically the whole point of my talk as well as my poetry that I read. As a young Muslim woman, I was not just any minority, but the one which perhaps bears the burden of a foreclosed discussion more than any other minority group in America, one which is expected to be unable to speak for itself, imagined to have emerged from under a mountain of oppression. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that I'm also talking about myself as an immigrant. And I'm saying that when I came to this country, I found that I was expected not to be able to speak my mind or to define myself. And I was already told who I was. And that I had come out of, like I said, emerged from under a mountain of oppression. These things are very specific to Muslim women. And if you noticed, I don't say Muslims, I say Muslim women. So does that clarify the point a little bit?
Yeah, that's true. But there would be some African American.
Well, African American women, and there are African American Muslim women too, right?
Yes.
So, okay. Yeah, I'll just stay here.
Powerful words. I'm sure somebody has some insight they would like to share.
Yes.
Thanks. You had I can't remember the second part of it. The first part was intuition over agenda. And then there was a second part that was really cool that I didn't get written down before I forgot it. But like in your use of poetry and story, how do you find that in some ways does contribute, if not to an agenda, to like the work of unfolding new possibilities and hope? But however you would frame that, how do you see your project as contributing to the larger work of liberation, hope, whatever you value?
So, as I said, there are two very distinct projects. They're simultaneous, they're both important, but I put more of an emphasis on this sort of work. Why? Because it's more inclusive. When you protest, you take a position against someone or something. That is necessary. If you envision a just world, if you envision peace, you have to take a stand against certain things. So many of these poems you'll find are protest poems. Now I want to also add that not all of these poems are protest poems. There are many poems about me, for instance, when my son was born, and I wrote a poem about how I felt when my son was born. This project is more about what I was saying, building a language that continues this tradition of peaceful coexistence. So there are two things that are happening simultaneously. I think they're both important, but I think all too often we don't put an emphasis on building anew, saying that let's start again, let's have a fresh start, let's think positive. As long as we carry on this game of blaming each other and thinking about history as something to draw vengeance from, we are not going to achieve anything. So protesting and recording our protest is an important thing. These are historical moments, and they have to be recorded. But on the other hand, building our civilization, doing positive things, constructive things, inclusive things, I think that is something that needs our attention. Yes. Thank you.
This is one of the first people that I've seen who actually has been about learning facts and imagining what that would be like or imagining it. And I think it's so difficult for people within warfare circumstances to be able to vocalize such imagery, considering that most of them would be victims of post-traumatic stress disorder and would then inhibit, the ability to be able to speak out against or describe what it could be to actually live through such circumstances, because they'd be deleting those memories from their mind. And I really would like to see you move forward with this on a larger platform.
Thank you.
And I don't know, maybe you want to approach some newspapers or politicians or something, but I think this needs more of a voice. Because even myself, I never had thought about certain imagery that you described. And then it just hit me all of a sudden. This actually needs more attention than perhaps in the media or even just talking about it on a face-to-face basis with people. Because I really feel for those victims. Even in Guantanamo Bay, it has been alerted that certain practices did take place. But I think poetry has a way of speaking in another way that it's more emotive.
Thank you for that comment. I want to say that when you say emotive, this is what poets want. The poets speak from their spirit. They don't speak from agendas. They see suffering, they are hit viscerally by it, and they try to make something that will have the same effect on the reader. Poets are also hermetic people. They like to stay by to themselves, keep to themselves, and just respond to their spirit. And this idea of inclusiveness and speaking from a place of compassion, again, it's not something as an agenda. Then compassion cannot be an agenda. It is something that it's really a response. That's what it is. And I'm very pleased to hear that it had that response on you, because that's really what poets do all this for. So thank you. Yes.
My question is somewhat related to that. For protest, and an analysis should have an effect on the changing of human condition some form. So you are here in Chicago now, and the audience is here somewhat, different from the people who will be speaking about these problems in their life. For instance, you spoke about child labor. Now, that's over there. You wrote a poem very touching. We all appreciated it. But how does it get translated to some action, which will change that human condition? Far distant land, which is happening. I'm mindful that it happened in the industrialized nations as well. You wrote this in Pakistan, Peshawar, and the motivating incident was the Christian boy's suicide when they did things.
He was not Western. He was a Pakistani Christian.
No. I understand.
Yeah.
You wrote it there, but you mentioned, some problem, oppression, child labor, and other things. So coming back to this specific point, how do you kind of generate this change, or you envision how this?
There are many ways to answer that question. The first answer that I'll give you is that this idea of poets writing poetry like this, well, you can call it protest poetry, you can give it any name, poetry that speaks about the human condition, about human suffering. Poets have been doing this for millennia. They have been writing about these things for literally millennia in every culture. Does it change anything? The honest answer is no. Poetry doesn't change anything. The only thing that it can change is number one, the poet. Because, like I said, poetry is an act of discovery on the page. The poet herself doesn't know what she's feeling, how she's feeling it until she has written the poem. Who can it change? It can change people who are already who are already feeling the suffering but need the words. So poetry is only one kind of peace building, and it's not necessarily the one that is going to transform society. Poetry is, you can think of it as like maybe the minute or the second hand in the clock of civilization. It's a very slow-moving thing, but it's necessary because the civilization has got to move in the right direction. So what poets do, what poets can do, the poets, I think they even if they take risks, they should speak truth to power. They should tell, at least, as I said, much of my work is about defining myself as a Muslim woman in the West. I'm not commenting on, I'm commenting on some universals, like you mentioned, things like exploitation, injustice, things like that. But much of it is motivated and inspired by my personal response to what is going on. Now, when you talk about movements, it's true that there have been instances in history where poets have been instrumental in leading a movement. And I think the most obvious example is Pakistan itself. Our country is called the dream of a poet. But we have to remember that he was not just a poet. He was also a political philosopher, and he was a leader who had, who did various things. He was a major scholar. So, I don't claim that I can change things, and I don't think any poet should claim that, because poetry, to a large extent, poetry is a subjective thing. A lot of how poetry is read is brought in by the reader. I find that, as this young lady just said, that there are many people from different backgrounds who tell me that this poetry speaks to them. And they're from different backgrounds, different countries, different backgrounds. And I think, to me, that's what I want to achieve. I want to be able to speak to a stranger, someone from a different generation, someone from a different culture, and be able to convey my idea. And much of it is universal. It's about suffering and peace. We all understand that. So, does that answer your question? Thank you. Okay.
Any final comments or questions?
Yes.
I always have a final question. This is somewhat of a mistake. The era that you described, I'm glad that Manino is here now, because we talked about it at his point too. We see that some of us who are either stupid enough or intelligent enough to conceive a time in the not too distant future where all the idyllic situations you described in Andalusia, we see that sort of thing taking place in the U.S. I know it's incomprehensible in today's political and social environment to think of U.S. as an ideal state in any way. But there are ideals in place. There are foundational ideals. Do you see, as a poet, that sort of thing evolving from the American society, from the American civilization, over our lifetime, our kids' lifetime?
Okay. So when I came to this country as a student in the 90s, I thought that this was very close to being, this is a very naive version of me, but being in an educational institution and having faculty members from who belong to different races, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, religious backgrounds, different genders, I thought that this was very, the idea, the utopia that I talk about in this book very much felt like it. Because I came from a homogenous country, and even though I count myself as very lucky to have been raised in a home and have been taught by teachers who were the amazing humanists, and people who I'm very fortunate to have been with. I felt that because this culture has is made up of many different cultures and races, I saw pluralism and I saw hope. Of course, when I learned more, I thought that what seemed, it wasn't as rosy as it seemed. There are always possibilities, and people approach Al-Andalus as different things. Some people approach it as empire. They will praise it as empire, and I think that empire is sort of antithetical to the idea of pluralism and equal rights, equal respect, equal place, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to say that it's not possible, even though I'm less naive than before. I think it's always possible. It happened before, it can happen again. One of the key things, though, is intellectual engagement. When people ask me about why, how this happened, what I think the reasons are, I give a funny answer and a serious answer. The funny answer is that the Mediterranean climate is wonderful, and you just can't be angry, and you can't be in conflict too long. And this is partially true. The second answer is that because these people were so deeply engaged in intellectual pursuits, and because they were invested in developing themselves on an intellectual level, they were able to look past their differences. So you had, especially among the Muslim and the Jewish communities in Al-Andalus, you saw a very, very, not only a deep engagement with intellectual pursuits, but closeness among each other for that reason. They built libraries together. One of the best known libraries, libraries at that time were private. So there were hundreds of libraries in 8th century Cordoba, in 9th century Al-Andalus. And one of the best known libraries was actually a work of collaboration between a Muslim woman and a Jewish man. They're both very famous people. The Muslim woman is the one that I mentioned before, the mathematician. And the Jewish man, again, there were many. This was the Jewish golden age. There's a whole lot. I'm forgetting which exactly, which person it was, but which luminary it was. But the point being that if there is a possibility of another Al-Andalus, another Convivencia, it's got to happen. It can only happen if there is a deeper intellectual engagement and trying to solve problems. If today everybody is engaged in solving the planet's problems, looking at 50 years from now, how will we feed ourselves? How will we grow our food? Will there be plenty of water to support the population? If today we give up everything and focus on those things and build solutions together, I can assure you, and at this moment, we don't even acknowledge this. We don't even know, and we don't even care that the planet is in a very desperate situation. The point being, if we think of our Earth, our home, as a common purpose, I think everything else would seem trivial. Everything else would seem trivial. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So where can you get these books?
They're on Amazon. I have a few copies here. But then they're, on the internet you'll find various. I think Amazon does it, and then my own publisher also sells it, Poetic Matrix Press. And I have about 10 copies here if anybody wants to get it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful to hear your words. I would now like to invite Dr. Ali Yurtsever, president of the college, to give you a token of our appreciation.
Thank you for the great performance. I would like to give a small gift from American Islamic College as a token of our appreciation. So this is also art, we made art. So more applause please. So thank you so much for your time and accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much.
This is a roof, the water marbling we call it. The original done by our students and professors. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Please take your